Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little more intimate, a little more awkward, and a lot less glamorous than the sagas would have you believe. We're pulling back the furs to look at what love, sex, and marriage were really like in the Viking Age. Forget the epic romances and the helmet-clad heroes sweeping maidens off their feet. The truth is, your love life as a Viking would be less about passion and more about property, less about soulmates and more about social contracts. And it would all happen in a smoky longhouse with your entire family watching. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe pour yourself a glass of mead, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You're a young, moderately healthy Viking living somewhere in 9th century Scandinavia. You've survived childhood, which is already a minor miracle, and now you're of age. That means it's time to think about settling down. But if you think this involves swiping right on a dating app or catching someone's eye across a crowded tavern, you are hilariously, tragically mistaken. Finding a partner in the Viking Age isn't a quest for love. It's a business negotiation, and you're not the CEO. You're the asset. Your family, specifically your father or the male head of your household, is in charge of your romantic future. This isn't about finding your soulmate. It's about forging alliances, consolidating land, and ensuring the family's honor and wealth continue to the next generation. It's less The Bachelor and more Shark Tank, but with more axes and fewer patents. If you're a young man, your value is determined by your family's status, the amount of land you stand to inherit, and your reputation as a warrior or a farmer. Are you a good provider? Can you swing a sword without tripping over your own feet? Do you own more than one goat? These are the questions that matter, not whether you have a good sense of humor or enjoy long walks on the fjord. Your potential bride's family will be assessing your worth like you're a prize bull at the county fair. If you're a woman, your currency is your dowry, your family's influence, and your perceived ability to run a household and produce heirs, preferably male. Your opinion on the matter is, to put it gently, irrelevant. You are a piece in a strategic game, a bridge between two families. Your marriage isn't the beginning of your love story, it's the closing of a deal. The process itself is formal and public. Your family's patriarch will approach the other family's patriarch. There will be discussions, negotiations, and the careful exchange of gifts. It's a transaction. Your hand in marriage is being traded for silver, land, or a promise of mutual support in the next feud. There's no room for romance in this equation. The concept of marrying for love would have seemed reckless, childish, and frankly, a little insane to most Vikings. Love might come later, a surprising and welcome bonus, like finding an extra piece of salted fish in your rations. But it was never, ever the starting point. So you stand there, awkwardly, while two old men with beards full of yesterday's breakfast decide your entire future. You might get a brief formal introduction to your intended, a quick glance across a smoky hall, but that's it. No dates, no heartfelt conversations, no finding out if they also hate the same sagas as you. You're getting married. The contracts have been drawn up, the price agreed upon. Now all that's left is the wedding, a public spectacle designed to make sure everyone in the village knows this deal is done, sealed, and non-refundable. So the deal has been struck, the dowry has been counted, and you're officially engaged to someone you've probably spoken to for a grand total of 5 minutes. Now comes the main event, the wedding. A Viking wedding wasn't a quiet, intimate affair. It was a loud, public, multi-day feast designed to legally and socially cement the alliance between two families. This was less a celebration of love and more the public filing of a very important business contract, just with more drinking and fewer staplers. The proceedings would begin with a formal ceremony, but don't picture a church or a priest. This is a pagan affair, likely officiated by a chieftain or a god-eye, a local religious leader. The core of the ceremony involves the exchange of swords and rings. If you're the groom, you present your father's sword to your new bride. This isn't just a gift, it's a symbolic transfer of protection. You are now her defender. She, in turn, gives you a sword from her own family, signifying the acceptance of this bond and the merging of two clans' fighting strength. Then come the rings, simple bands of silver or gold, exchanged as a sign of the oath. These oaths are sworn publicly, in front of everyone who matters. You both promise to uphold your duties, to honor each other's families, and to run a household together. Lying or breaking this oath isn't just bad form. It's a legal and social disaster that could lead to feuds, fines, or being exiled. After the serious business of oaths and swords, the party begins, and a Viking wedding feast was legendary. It could last for days, with rivers of mead and ale, mountains of roasted meat, and endless storytelling and song. This wasn't just for fun. The feasting had a purpose. It was a display of wealth and generosity. A family that could host a week-long party for the entire village was a family with power and resources. It was the ultimate social flex. During the feast, there would be rituals. The bride's hair, traditionally worn long and loose as a maiden, would be ceremoniously braided and pinned up, a symbol of her new status as a married woman. She would be given the keys to the longhouse, signifying her new role as the husfreyja, the lady of the household, with full authority over its domestic affairs. The night would end with the ceremonial bedding. The bride and groom would be escorted to the bedchamber by witnesses, a public acknowledgement that the marriage was to be consummated. It sounds incredibly awkward, and it probably was, but it served a legal purpose. A marriage wasn't fully binding until it was consummated, and having witnesses to the bedding part made it official. You might wake up the next morning with a pounding headache from all the mead, married to a near stranger, and with the full weight of a new family's expectations on your shoulders. The party's over. The real work has just begun. Now that you've survived your own wedding and the subsequent multi-day hangover, it's time to settle into your role as a Viking husband. And let's be clear, this isn't about being a sensitive, emotionally available partner. Your job description is brutally simple. You are the provider, the protector, and the legal representative of your household. Your worth is measured in silver, in land, and in the strength of your sword arm. Fail at any of these, and your marriage and your life could be in serious jeopardy. First and foremost, you are the provider. Whether you're a farmer, a craftsman, a trader, or a raider, your primary duty is to bring in the resources to keep your family fed, clothed, and housed. If the harvest fails, it's on you. If the longhouse roof leaks, it's on you. If you come back from a trading voyage with nothing but leaky barrels and a bad story, you've failed. A husband who couldn't provide was seen as weak and could even be legally divorced by his wife for it. No pressure. Next, you are the protector. Your household is your responsibility, and that includes defending it from rival clans, opportunistic raiders, or just the local bully who thinks your prize sheep looks tasty. This is where your honor, or hider, comes in. Your reputation is everything. An insult to your wife, your children, or your property is an insult to you, and it must be answered. This could mean a formal duel, a legal challenge at the local assembly, the thing, or just a good old-fashioned axe fight. Backing down wasn't an option. It would brand you as a coward, a Nedinger, the worst thing a Viking man could be. As the head of the household, you also hold the legal authority. You represent your family at the thing. You make the final decisions on property and contracts. And you are legally responsible for the actions of everyone living under your roof, including your wife, children, and slaves. However, this wasn't absolute tyranny. While you had the final say, a wise husband listened to his wife, especially when it came to domestic matters. A man who ignored his wife's counsel was often seen as a fool in the sagas. Your relationship with your wife is a partnership, albeit an unequal one. You are the public face of the family, the one who deals with the outside world of politics, feuds, and trade. She is the master of the inside world, the one who runs the farm, manages the supplies, and holds the keys. Together, you form a functional economic unit. Romance, affection, those are private matters. In public, you are a team, a business, and the success of that business rests squarely on your shoulders. So you stand at the door of your longhouse, axe in hand, looking out at your fields, knowing that every single person inside depends on you. Don't mess it up. So you're a newly married Viking woman. While your husband is out dealing with feuds, farming, or sailing off to trade with unsuspecting coastal villages, you're not just sitting at home weaving tapestries and waiting for his return. You are the husfreyja, the lady of the house, and your role is one of immense power, responsibility, and relentless hard work. Forget the damsel in distress trope. A Viking wife was the household's chief operating officer, and the longhouse was her boardroom. First, let's talk about the keys. On your wedding day, you were given the keys to the longhouse, and this was no mere symbol. You literally held the keys to the family's wealth. The chests containing food, valuables, and imported goods were under your control. You managed the pantry, rationing supplies to last through the long, brutal winters. You oversaw the production of cloth, from shearing the sheep to spinning the wool and weaving the fabric for your family's clothes. You were in charge of brewing the ale and mead, a crucial task for both daily life and social gatherings. If a guest arrived, it was your job to offer hospitality, a sacred duty in Norse culture. A household's reputation for generosity rested on your shoulders. Your domain was the innengards, the world inside the fence of the farmstead, and within that space, your authority was nearly absolute. You directed the work of children, servants, and slaves. You were the family's primary healer, using knowledge of herbs and folk remedies to treat sickness and injury. You were the financial manager, overseeing the household budget and ensuring that the farm was profitable. When your husband was away on a raid or a trading journey, which could be for months or even years, you ran everything. You weren't just keeping the home fires burning. You were the acting head of the household, making decisions about livestock, crops, and even defense. This is a far cry from the submissive, homebound roles of women in many other contemporary cultures. Viking women could own property, inherit land, and as we'll see, even initiate divorce. This legal standing gave them a level of autonomy that was revolutionary for the time. However, this power came with a heavy burden of labor. Your hands were not soft. They were calloused from grinding grain, churning butter, and working the loom. Your days were long, starting before sunrise and ending long after sunset. And while you held authority at home, your public voice was limited. You couldn't speak at the thing or lead a war party. Your power was domestic, but in a world where the household was the core of society, that was no small thing. The sagas are filled with formidable women who were just as cunning, ambitious, and ruthless as their husbands. They weren't shield maidens in the fantastical sense, but they were warriors of a different kind, fighting battles of survival, management, and endurance every single day. As the Husfreyja, you weren't just a wife, you were the anchor of the Viking world. All right, let's pull back the furs and talk about the part of Viking life that the epic sagas tend to gloss over: the actual, physical act of sex. In a world devoid of romantic comedies and scented candles, sex, in the Viking Age, was viewed with a stark pragmatism that might seem cold to us today. It wasn't primarily about love, passion, or mutual fulfillment. It was about procreation, social duty, and the continuation of a bloodline. First, let's set the scene. You're living in a longhouse. This is a single, large, open room that you share with your spouse, your children, your parents, your cousins, and possibly a few farmhands and slaves. There are no private bedrooms. Your bed is likely a raised wooden platform along the wall, separated from the next family's sleeping area by maybe a hanging tapestry or just wishful thinking. Privacy, as a concept, does not exist. Every cough, every snore, and every intimate moment is potentially public knowledge. The idea of a romantic private evening is a modern fantasy. Your sex life is happening in the same room where your great aunt is telling stories to the kids, and a dog is chewing on a bone by the fire. This lack of privacy likely shaped the act itself. It was probably quick, quiet, and done under the cover of furs and darkness. There was no cultural emphasis on foreplay or female pleasure, at least not in any way that was recorded. The sagas and legal codes are concerned with the results of sex, pregnancy, inheritance, and honor, not the experience of it. The primary purpose of sex within a marriage was to produce heirs. A man needed a son to inherit his land and carry on his name. A woman's value was heavily tied to her fertility. A barren wife could be a legitimate reason for divorce. This placed immense pressure on couples to be fruitful. It wasn't a choice. It was a fundamental duty to the family and the clan. Outside of marriage, the rules were strict and gendered. For a married woman, any sexual activity with another man was a grave offense, a stain on her husband's honor that could result in her divorce and social ruin, and a death sentence for her lover. For a man, however, the rules were far more flexible. While sleeping with another man's wife was a capital offense, a man was generally free to have sex with concubines or slaves without it affecting his marriage. These women, known as frilla, had no legal rights and were considered part of his property. This created a stark, double standard. A man's sexuality was a tool for pleasure and demonstrating status. A woman's was a tool for producing legitimate heirs and maintaining her husband's honor. There was very little room for personal desire in this framework, especially for women. Sex was a function, a duty, a biological necessity wrapped up in a complex web of laws, honor, and the ever-present need to survive. In a society where marriage was a business deal and sex was a procreative duty, did the Vikings even know what love was? The answer is yes, absolutely. But their understanding of it was vastly different from our modern, Hollywood-fueled ideals of romance. Love in the Viking Age wasn't the reason you got married. If you were lucky, it was the result of it. Think of it less as a spark that starts a fire and more as the slow burning warmth that builds from a well-tended hearth. The Norse languages had several words for different kinds of love and affection, suggesting a nuanced understanding of human connection. There was the bond of frith, the deep loyalty and peace between kin and allies, which a good marriage was meant to foster. But there was also evidence of passionate, personal love, the kind that poets write about and that drives people to do great and terrible things. You can find it hidden in the sagas and skaldic poetry. While these stories are often focused on heroism, feuds, and honor, there are moments of profound tenderness and heartbreak. Husbands and wives are sometimes depicted as deeply devoted partners who mourn each other's deaths with a grief that is raw and real. In the Laxdæla saga, the famous lines spoken by the female protagonist Gudrun Osvifsdottir, "I was worse to him I loved the most," encapsulates the tragic and complex nature of love in a world governed by honor and revenge. Love was often expressed not through grand romantic gestures, but through steadfast loyalty and mutual respect. A husband who valued his wife's counsel. A wife who skillfully managed the farm in her husband's absence. These were the practical demonstrations of a strong bond. It was a love built on shared struggle and partnership. Affection was likely a private affair. In the public sphere of the longhouse or the assembly, a stoic and composed demeanor was valued. But in the quiet moments, away from the prying eyes of the clan, we can imagine the same human emotions we feel today. A shared joke, a comforting touch, a quiet understanding. However, this love could also be a destructive force. The sagas are filled with tales of love triangles, jealousy, and passion leading to bloodshed. Love could inspire poetry, but it could also inspire murder. It was a powerful, unpredictable emotion in a world that prized order and control. It wasn't something you based a marriage on because it was seen as too volatile, too dangerous. A marriage needed to be built on a foundation of property and politics, something solid and dependable. Love was the wildflower that might grow in the cracks of that foundation. Beautiful, rare, and a little bit wild. So while your marriage might have started with a handshake between your fathers, it didn't have to end there. Over years of shared hardship, raising children, and running a household, a deep and abiding love could certainly grow. It just wasn't guaranteed, and it was never the point. Let's talk about infidelity. Because in a world of arranged marriages and long sea voyages, it was bound to happen. But in the Viking Age, cheating wasn't a simple matter of betrayal. It was a complex issue tied to honor, gender, and the law. And the rules for men and women were, to put it mildly, not the same. If you were a Viking husband, your marital obligations were primarily legal and economic, not sexually exclusive. Society largely turned a blind eye to a man's extramarital affairs, provided he was discreet and, most importantly, chose his partners carefully. It was perfectly acceptable for a man, especially a wealthy chieftain, to have one or more concubines, known as frilor. These women were typically of lower social status, or more often, slaves, thralls, captured during raids. They lived in the man's household, and he could have sex with them whenever he pleased. They had no legal rights. Their children were considered illegitimate and had no claim to inheritance unless the father formally adopted them. From a modern perspective, this is state-sanctioned sexual exploitation. But in the Viking world, it was a display of status. A man with multiple women was a man of power and wealth. However, this freedom had a massive, life-threatening exception. While you could sleep with your own slaves and concubines, you could absolutely not, under any circumstances, sleep with another free man's wife. This wasn't a crime of love. It was a crime of property and honor. A man's wife was part of his household, and to have an affair with her was to steal from him, and, worse, to cast doubt on the legitimacy of his heirs. This was a profound insult to his honor, his Horde. The penalty for this was not a stern talking to. The wronged husband had the legal right to kill both his wife's lover and, in some cases, his wife on the spot, without facing any legal repercussions. It was considered justifiable homicide. Sagas are littered with the bloody consequences of such affairs, often kicking off multi-generational blood feuds that consumed entire families. Even lesser forms of intimacy were legally actionable. A man could be fined or declared an outlaw for composing a love poem about another man's wife, or for touching her hand or hair without permission. These weren't seen as romantic gestures. They were violations. So, as a Viking man, your sexual playground had clearly defined, and very dangerous, fences. You could enjoy the company of women you owned, but if you even looked at another man's wife the wrong way, you'd better be prepared to defend yourself with an axe. It was a system that protected a man's honor and property above all else, while institutionalizing a brutal double standard that left many women, especially the enslaved, with no protection at all. Now, let's flip the drinking horn and look at infidelity from the other side. If you are a Viking wife, the rules of the game are not just different, they are lethally strict. The double standard that gave your husband a degree of sexual freedom does not, in any way, apply to you. Your fidelity is not a personal choice. It is a cornerstone of your husband's honor, the legitimacy of your children, and the stability of the entire family alliance. For a married woman, any sexual contact with a man other than her husband was the ultimate transgression. This wasn't just seen as a moral failing. It was a direct attack on the patriarchal structure of Viking society. Why was it so serious? It all came down to inheritance and honor. A wife's affair introduced the catastrophic possibility of a cuckoo in the nest, a child who was not the husband's biological heir, but who might inherit his property, his name, and his legacy. In a world where bloodlines were everything, this was an existential threat to the family. It undermined the very foundation of ownership and lineage. The consequences were swift and brutal. As mentioned, a husband who caught his wife in the act of adultery had the legal right to kill her and her lover without penalty. This was not considered murder. It was the rightful restoration of his honor. Even if he didn't resort to immediate violence, the social and legal fallout was devastating. An unfaithful wife could be divorced instantly and unceremoniously. She would be sent away in shame, losing not only her home and her children, but also her claim to her dowry and any marital property. She would become a social outcast, a skesser, a trollop or monster, bringing deep shame upon her own family. Her father and brothers might even refuse to take her back, leaving her utterly destitute and without protection. There was no forgiveness, no second chances. The law was clear and unforgiving. The sagas reinforce this with grim consistency. Women accused of infidelity are often met with violent ends, either at the hands of their husbands or as a result of the blood feuds their actions ignite. Their stories serve as cautionary tales, warnings to other women about the dire consequences of stepping outside the strict bounds of marital fidelity. This rigid standard placed an enormous burden on women. Their bodies and their sexuality were not their own. They were the property of their husbands and the vessels for their lineage. While her husband might have concubines living under the same roof, she was expected to maintain absolute fidelity under the constant watch of the household and the community. Any deviation was a gamble with her life and the honor of everyone she was connected to. In the world of Viking relationships, a man's honor was defined by his strength and wealth, but a huge part of it was also defined by his wife's chastity, making her a gatekeeper of a status she was not fully allowed to possess herself. So, your marriage isn't working out. Your husband spends more time polishing his axe than talking to you, or your wife has made it clear she'd rather be managing a different farm, preferably one on the other side of Scandinavia. In many ancient societies, you'd be stuck. But this is the Viking Age, and here, divorce was not only possible, it was surprisingly straightforward. Forget messy court battles, expensive lawyers, and drawn-out custody disputes. Viking divorce was a public, no-nonsense affair, available to both men and women, though for different reasons. The process was simple and powerful. To initiate a divorce, all you had to do was summon a group of witnesses, stand before your front door, and publicly declare yourself divorced. Then, you had to repeat the declaration at your bedside. That was it. No paperwork, no magistrate, just a clear public statement that the contract was terminated. The key was the public nature of the act. The marriage was a public alliance, so its dissolution had to be equally public to be considered legally valid. But you couldn't just get divorced because you were bored. You needed a legitimate reason, and the sagas and law codes give us a glimpse into what qualified. For a man, a common reason to divorce his wife was her infertility, especially if she failed to produce a male heir. He could also divorce her for adultery, as we've discussed, or for bringing shame upon the family through her actions. Poor management of the household could also be grounds for dismissal. If she was wasteful with supplies, or couldn't effectively run the farm, she wasn't fulfilling her end of the marital contract. But what's truly revolutionary is that women also had the right to initiate divorce. A wife could leave her husband if he failed to provide for the family. If he was lazy, a poor farmer, or a failed raider, and the family was starving, she could declare the marriage over. Physical abuse was another valid reason. If a husband struck his wife, she had the right to leave him. In some law codes, even 3 slaps were enough to trigger a divorce. And then there were the insults. Viking society was obsessed with honor, and this extended to clothing. If a husband forced his wife to wear clothes considered inappropriate, or if he himself cross-dressed or wore overly effeminate clothing, a sign of ergi, she could divorce him for the shame it brought upon the household. One of the most famous examples from the sagas involves a husband who makes fun of his wife for wearing a low-cut dress. She was so offended by the insult that she divorced him on the spot. When a divorce occurred, the division of property was also surprisingly clear. The woman was entitled to take her dowry back with her. Any property she brought into the marriage was hers to keep. The shared marital property was often divided, ensuring that a woman wasn't left completely destitute. This legal and economic protection gave Viking women a degree of power and autonomy that was virtually unheard of in Christian Europe at the time. Divorce wasn't a scandal. It was a practical solution to a failed contract. The power of a Viking woman to unilaterally end her marriage is one of the most striking and progressive aspects of Norse society, setting it apart from almost every other culture of its time. While a man's reasons for divorce often revolved around heirs and honor, a woman's right to divorce was grounded in a clear set of legal protections that guarded her dignity, her safety, and her economic well-being. This wasn't a system based on sentiment. It was a system based on contract law, and a woman was considered a key party to that contract. One of the most fundamental grounds for a woman-initiated divorce was the failure of her husband to be a provider. The marriage was at its core an economic partnership. His job was to bring resources in. Hers was to manage them. If he couldn't hold up his end of the bargain, if he was too lazy to work the farm, too inept to succeed in trade, or too cowardly to go on raids, and the family was suffering as a result, she could legally dissolve the union. This wasn't seen as her being greedy. It was her exercising her right to not starve because of an incompetent partner. Physical abuse was another powerful trigger. While Viking society was violent, there were clear lines. A husband striking his wife was a violation of her honor and the honor of her family. The Icelandic law code, the Gragas, is explicit on this. If a husband hit his wife, she could not only divorce him, but also claim financial compensation for the injury, both physical and to her honor. Her family could even be called upon to seek revenge on her behalf. A man who beat his wife was not seen as strong. He was seen as dishonorable and out of control. Public humiliation was also a valid cause. A husband's honor and his wife's were intertwined. If he shamed her publicly, he shamed himself and their entire alliance. The sagas provide fascinating examples. As mentioned, a husband mocking his wife's clothing was enough to end a marriage. Why? Because the insult wasn't just about a dress. It was a public attack on her status and dignity. In another saga, a wife divorces her husband because he can't grow a proper beard, a sign of unmanliness that reflected poorly on her. These might seem trivial to us, but in a world built on reputation, they were serious breaches of the social contract. Perhaps most importantly, a divorced woman did not walk away empty-handed. She retained ownership of her dowry and any personal property. This economic independence was crucial. It meant that divorce wasn't a sentence of poverty. A woman could return to her family with her wealth intact, potentially to remarry and forge a new alliance. This gave her real leverage within the marriage. Her husband knew that if he failed in his duties, she had a viable exit strategy. This system, while far from perfect, gave Viking women a degree of agency that was truly exceptional. She was not her husband's property. She was his partner in a legally binding and legally dissolvable contract. In the Viking world, a home without the noise of children was a home in decline. Children weren't just a joy, they were a necessity, the very future of the family's lineage, labour force, and legacy. The pressure to have children, especially sons, was immense, and the life of a Viking child was anything but easy. From the moment of birth, a child's survival was not guaranteed. The father held the ultimate authority over whether a newborn would be accepted into the family. After a child was born, it was placed on the floor at the father's feet. If he picked the child up, named it, and had it sprinkled with water, it was formally accepted into the kin. This act, known as Autovatni, was a public declaration of legitimacy. If, however, the father chose not to accept the child, its fate was grim. This was the dark reality of infant exposure, or bera ut barn. A newborn could be rejected for a variety of reasons. It might be born with a physical deformity, it might be the child of a slave, or the family might simply not have the resources to feed another mouth during a harsh winter or famine. Girls were more likely to be exposed than boys, as sons were needed to inherit land and carry on the family name. The rejected infant would be taken out and left in the wilderness to die of exposure or be taken by animals. It was a brutal but accepted practice, seen as a necessary, if tragic, part of survival in a harsh world. Once a child was accepted, their upbringing was practical and unsentimental. There was no concept of a protected, innocent childhood as we know it. From a very young age, children were expected to contribute. Boys would learn to farm, hunt, and fight alongside their fathers. They were given wooden swords and taught the ways of the warrior from the moment they could walk. Girls learned the complex tasks of running a household from their mothers, mastering weaving, cooking, healing, and managing supplies. Education was not formal. There were no schools. Children learned by watching, doing, and listening to the sagas and poems recited around the fire at night. These stories were their history lessons, their moral compass, and their entertainment, filled with heroes, gods, and monsters that shaped their worldview. Life was fraught with danger. Disease, accidents, and malnutrition were constant threats. Mortality rates were high, and few children were coddled. They were expected to be resilient, tough, and useful. The transition to adulthood was swift. By their early teens, they were considered adults, ready for marriage, work, and war. A child was not just a person, it was an investment in the family's future, a link in the chain of generations, and their survival was a victory against the unforgiving backdrop of the Viking Age. When we delve into the sagas and legal texts of the Viking Age, we find a world meticulously concerned with honor, property, and the proper roles of men and women. But what about relationships that fell outside these norms? Specifically, what was the Norse view on same-sex relationships? The answer is complex, shrouded in ambiguity, and heavily focused on one thing: honor. The historical record is almost entirely silent on female same-sex relationships. This doesn't necessarily mean they didn't exist, but rather that they were not considered a legal or social concern. Since female sexuality was primarily defined by its role in procreation and marriage, A relationship between two women, which produced no heirs and didn't threaten a man's lineage, was likely ignored or simply not seen as a notable category of being. It flew completely under the radar of a legal system obsessed with property and inheritance. For men, however, the situation was very different, and the condemnation was not about the act itself, but about the perceived role within it. The Norse world had a powerful and deeply pejorative concept known as ergi, or argagar, for a person. This term is difficult to translate directly, but carries connotations of being unmanly, cowardly, effeminate, and crucially, sexually receptive. In the context of a same-sex relationship between men, the man who took the passive or female role was considered arga. This was the ultimate insult. To be arga was to forsake one's masculinity, to be seen as weak and womanly in a society that prized warrior strength above all else. Calling a man arga was a nid, a legal term for a grave insult that the accused man was legally entitled to avenge with violence. He could kill his accuser on the spot and face no legal penalty. This tells us that the stigma was not against desire for other men, but against the act of sexual submission. The active partner in a male same-sex encounter did not seem to carry the same stigma. His actions were seen as dominant and penetrative, which aligned with masculine ideals. He was not surrendering his manhood. This is a recurring theme in many ancient patriarchal societies, including ancient Rome, where the citizen's honor was preserved as long as he was the active partner. Interestingly, the concept of ergi also extended to the practice of a certain kind of magic, cider. This form of shamanistic magic, associated with divination and shaping fate, was considered women's work. Male practitioners of cider were also labeled arga, because they were seen as taking on a spiritually receptive and therefore feminine role. Even the god Odin, the foremost practitioner of cider, was taunted by Loki for it in one poem. So there was no Viking concept of homosexuality as an identity. There was only a deep-seated cultural anxiety around masculinity and the shame associated with a man taking a non-dominant role, whether in bed or in magic. It was a world where your sexual role could define your honor, and an insult about it could get you killed. The structure of a Viking household was often more complex than a simple nuclear family. For men of wealth and status, particularly chieftains and kings, it was common to have not just a wife, but also one or more concubines. This practice, while seeming scandalous to us, was a fully integrated and accepted part of Norse society, reflecting the era's views on power, status, and the starkly different roles of women. These concubines were known as freer. A freer was essentially a long-term mistress who lived in the man's household. She was not his legal wife, and did not have the same rights or status as the husfreyja. The relationship was not sealed by a formal contract or dowry. Often, frilla were women of lower social standing or, very commonly, enslaved women, thralls, who had been captured on raids. An enslaved woman had no right to refuse her master's sexual advances. This is the brutal reality behind the system. It was often built on a foundation of sexual servitude. Having a frilla or several was a sign of a man's power and prosperity. It demonstrated that he was wealthy enough to support a large and complex household. It was a status symbol, much like owning fine weapons or a large herd of cattle. The legal wife, the husfreyja, had to tolerate the presence of these other women. While she retained her authority over the household, the situation was likely a source of tension and jealousy, though the sagas rarely delve into the wife's emotional perspective on the matter. It was simply a fact of life for the wife of a powerful man. The children born from these unions, known as frillebørn, occupied a grey area in Viking society. They were not considered legitimate heirs in the same way as the wife's children. They had no automatic right to inherit their father's property or title. However, they were not complete outcasts. They were acknowledged as the man's offspring and were often raised within the household. A father could choose to formally accept a concubine's child, granting them a portion of the inheritance and raising their social standing. Some of the most famous figures in the sagas were the sons of concubines, who, through their own merit or their father's favour, rose to positions of great power. This system highlights the pragmatic and patriarchal nature of Viking relationships. Marriage was for alliances and legitimate heirs. Concubinage was for pleasure, status, and the potential for more children, albeit of a lower class. It was a system that reinforced the power of wealthy men while institutionalizing a rigid hierarchy among women, with the legal wife at the top and the enslaved frilla at the very bottom, her body and her children subject entirely to the will of her master. In a world without photography or social media, how did the Vikings perceive beauty? Their standards were not driven by fleeting trends, but by the harsh realities of their environment and the core values of their culture: health, strength, and status. Attractiveness was, first and foremost, a sign of a life well lived. For both men and women, a healthy, robust physique was highly prized. In a world where manual labor was constant and survival depended on physical resilience, a strong body was a beautiful body. For men, this meant broad shoulders, a powerful build, and the scars of battle, which were seen not as blemishes, but as a record of honor and experience. A full, well-groomed beard was also a sign of masculinity and maturity. For women, features that suggested good health and fertility were considered beautiful. Clear skin, bright eyes, and a strong frame were signs that she could endure the rigors of childbirth and manage a demanding household. But Viking beauty standards went beyond the purely physical. Grooming was surprisingly important, shattering the popular myth of the perpetually filthy, shaggy barbarian. Archaeological finds have uncovered a wealth of grooming tools: combs made of bone and antler, tweezers, and even tiny ear scoops for cleaning wax. Vikings, it seems, were quite meticulous about their personal hygiene. They bathed regularly, at least once a week, which was far more frequently than many other Europeans of the era. Hair was a particularly important symbol of status and identity for both sexes. Long flowing hair was a sign of a free person. Slaves often had their hair cropped short. Men and women took great pride in their hair, often washing it, combing it, and styling it in intricate braids. Blonde hair was particularly admired, and some Vikings, both men and women, were known to use a strong lye-based soap to bleach their hair to a pale yellow or even reddish hue. This wasn't just vanity. It was a way of emulating the gods, many of whom, like Thor, were depicted as fair-haired. Clothing also played a role. While the average person wore simple, undyed wool or linen tunics, the wealthy could afford garments dyed in vibrant colours like red, blue, and green, decorated with silk embroidery and fur trim. Jewelry was another key indicator of status. Silver and gold arm rings, brooches to fasten cloaks, and elaborate necklaces were not just adornments. They were portable wealth, a way to display one's success and power. A person's beauty was a reflection of their entire being, their health, their lineage, their wealth, and their place in the world. It wasn't about conforming to a single narrow ideal, but about embodying the strength and vitality needed to thrive in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the North. The romanticized image of the Viking warrior often involves noble battles and heroic quests, but we must confront a darker, more brutal aspect of their culture, one that is inextricably linked to their views on sex and power. The reality of raiding and sexual violence. When Viking longships appeared on the horizon of a foreign shore, they brought with them not just axes and swords, but a wave of terror that targeted the very fabric of a community. Raids were not just about plunder. They were about demonstrating dominance, and sexual violence was a key tool in that brutal assertion of power. The primary victims were women. During a raid on a monastery, a village or a town, women were considered part of the spoils of war, alongside gold, silver, and livestock. They were captured and enslaved, their fates now entirely in the hands of their captors. These enslaved women, known as thralls in Norse society, had no rights, no protection, and no bodily autonomy. They were property. Once brought back to Scandinavia, these women were forced into a life of servitude, performing domestic labor and, for many, enduring repeated sexual abuse. A Viking man could have sex with his female slaves whenever he wished, without consent and without consequence. It wasn't considered rape in the legal sense because, under Norse law, a slave could not be raped. She could only be damaged, as one would damage a piece of property. The children born from these forced unions were also born into slavery, belonging to the mother's owner. While a master could choose to free his slave or her child, it was entirely at his discretion. This system of sexual enslavement was not a dirty secret. It was an open and accepted part of the Viking economy and social structure. The wealth and manpower that fueled the Viking Age were built in large part on the bodies of captured women. This reality starkly contrasts with the surprising legal rights afforded to free Viking women within their own society. A free woman could divorce her husband for a slap, but an enslaved woman could be beaten and raped with impunity. This highlights a crucial aspect of the Viking worldview. Rights and honor were privileges of the in-group. Outsiders, especially those captured in war, were dehumanized and stripped of all protections. The sagas, while often glorifying the exploits of raiders, do not shy away from this brutality. They speak matter-of-factly of the capturing of female thralls and their role in the household. There is no moral condemnation. It was simply the way of the warrior, the right of the conqueror. To understand the Viking Age, we must look at it in its entirety. The masterful shipbuilding, the rich mythology, the complex social structures, and also the profound and systematic violence that made it all possible. The Viking world was not a simple one of an us versus them mentality, where one's own tribe and family were to be protected with an ironclad code of honor, while outsiders were fair game for the most brutal forms of exploitation. This duality is central to understanding their worldview and the often contradictory nature of their society. In a society with a clear system of marriage and concubinage, what place was there for commercial sex work? Prostitution did exist in the Viking Age, but it was a shadowy, low-status, and dangerous existence, far removed from any romanticized notion of organized brothels or powerful courtesans. The records are sparse, which in itself is telling. Prostitution was not a respected or even a formally recognized profession. It was part of the underbelly of society, practiced by women who were often desperate, impoverished, or social outcasts. These women were not protected by the law and were highly vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Norse society placed immense value on a free woman's reputation and her role within a family structure. A woman who sold her body was operating outside of this framework entirely. She had no husband to defend her honor, no family to avenge her, and no legal standing. This made her an easy target. The Old Norse language had several derogatory terms for prostitutes, often linking them with witchcraft, filth, or general untrustworthiness. They were seen as morally corrupt and were at the very bottom of the social ladder for free women, only a step above enslaved thralls. Unlike in some other cultures, like ancient Rome, there is no evidence of state-sanctioned brothels or a regulated sex trade in the Viking world. Prostitution was likely an informal and opportunistic affair, taking place in the bustling, transient environments of trading towns and ports, where sailors, merchants, and soldiers gathered. A woman might offer her services in a tavern or from a small hut on the edge of a settlement. The payment would have been meagre: a few coins, a piece of food, or a scrap of cloth. This was not a path to wealth. It was a desperate means of survival for women who had no other options, such as widows without family support, or women who had been cast out for other reasons. The clients were likely men who were unmarried, traveling, or simply seeking sexual release outside the confines of their own households. However, frequenting a prostitute was not without its own social risks for a man. While not illegal, it could be seen as dishonorable, or a sign of a man who couldn't secure a proper wife or manage his own household. A man's reputation was paramount, and being associated with the sordid fringes of society was not something a man of status would do openly. In essence, prostitution in the Viking Age was a grim and marginalized existence. It was a reflection of the harsh realities faced by women who, for whatever reason, found themselves without the protection of a family or a husband in a world that offered very few safety nets. It stands in stark contrast to the powerful role of the husfreyja, reminding us that a woman's fate in the Viking Age was almost entirely determined by her connection to a male-led household. How did a culture so pragmatic about marriage and so brutal in its raids express the delicate emotions of love and longing? The answer lies in the intricate, elusive, and powerful world of skaldic poetry and the epic sweep of the family sagas. These literary forms give us a rare window into the Viking heart, revealing a people who felt as deeply as they fought. Skaldic poetry was the high art of the Viking Age, composed by highly trained poets, or skalds, who served in the courts of kings and chieftains. This poetry was incredibly complex, governed by strict rules of meter, alliteration, and internal rhyme. But its most famous feature was the use of and here, metaphorical compound phrases and poetic synonyms. A warrior wasn't a warrior, he was a feeder of ravens. A ship was a wave horse. And love was rarely spoken of directly. Instead, a poet might speak of a woman as a goddess of linen, or a tree of necklaces. The emotion was veiled in elaborate imagery, a sign of intellectual and artistic prowess. A skald wouldn't say, "I love you." He might compose a verse describing how the thought of a particular woman was a battle of the mind, or how her presence was like sunshine on the sea. This indirectness wasn't due to a lack of emotion, but to a cultural preference for stoicism and restraint. To speak of love too openly was considered unmanly or foolish. The art was in the subtlety, the cleverness of the metaphor. The sagas, on the other hand, show us love in action, or more often love as the catalyst for tragedy. These prose narratives, written down in Iceland centuries after the Viking Age, tell the stories of real families, their feuds, their voyages, and their passions. In the sagas, love is a powerful and often destructive force. It drives men to kill, women to seek revenge, and families to ruin. The story of Helga the Fair in Gunnlaug's saga Ormstungu is a classic example of a tragic love triangle where two poets compete for the same woman, a rivalry that ultimately leads to both of their deaths. What's striking about love in the sagas is its connection to fate, or örlög. Characters don't just fall in love, they are destined to love, often with tragic consequences. Their passion is a force of nature, as uncontrollable as a storm at sea. There are moments of genuine tenderness too. In the Laxdæla saga, Kjartan Ólafsson and Gudrun Osvifsdottir share a deep and famous love, but circumstances and pride keep them apart. Years later, after Kjartan has been killed in a feud she helped instigate, Gudrun confesses, "To the one I loved most, I was the worst." This single line captures the profound regret and complexity of love in a world where honor and emotion were in constant conflict. Through these stories, we see that the Vikings were not unfeeling brutes. They were capable of deep devotion, searing jealousy, and heartbreaking sorrow. They just had a different language for it. A language of metaphor, action, and tragic destiny. In the Viking world, your reputation was your most valuable possession, and the law reflected this obsession with honor. Norse legal codes were not just about property and physical harm. They were incredibly specific about sexual conduct and, perhaps more importantly, sexual insults. The laws surrounding sex were designed to protect lineage and a man's honor. For instance, it was illegal for a man to be in a woman's bed, even if they were just talking. The act itself created the appearance of impropriety and could be grounds for a complaint. Similarly, as discussed, a man who composed a love poem, or mansunga, about a woman he wasn't married to could be outlawed. The poem was seen as a public declaration of desire, a violation of her husband's or father's authority over her. This wasn't about protecting the woman's feelings. It was about protecting the man's honor. But the most serious legal and social transgressions revolved around insults, particularly those that questioned a man's masculinity. The concept of ergi, or unmanliness, was the most potent weapon in any verbal arsenal. To accuse a man of being argar, the receptive partner in a same-sex act, was the ultimate insult. This was known as a nid, and it was so serious that the insulted party was legally justified in killing the insulter on the spot. This wasn't just about homophobia in the modern sense. It was about a deeply ingrained belief that a man's role was to be dominant and powerful. To suggest he was submissive was to strip him of his very identity as a man. The law took this so seriously that even creating a nidipole, A pole carved with a sexually insulting image, often of two men, and aimed at an enemy's farm, was a crime punishable by outlawry. The imagery was believed to have magical power, capable of bringing shame and misfortune upon the target. Verbal insults were just as powerful. Calling a man a mare, a bitch, or comparing him to a female animal was a direct attack on his manhood. The law codes laid out specific fines for different levels of insult. Even suggesting a man was cowardly or weak could land you in front of the local assembly. On the flip side, the laws also offered some protection to women from unwanted advances. A man could be fined for touching a woman inappropriately or making unwanted sexual remarks. While the legal system was heavily weighted in favor of men, these laws show a recognition that a woman's person, at least a free woman's, had a degree of sanctity. This wasn't about her right to consent in the modern sense, but about protecting her as a valuable part of her family's honor. In essence, the Viking legal system was a complex web of rules designed to regulate a society teetering on the edge of violence. It channeled aggression into a formal system of fines, duels, and assemblies. And at the heart of it all was the fragile, explosive, and all-important concept of a man's honor, which could be shattered with a single, well-aimed word. Imagine trying to have a private conversation, a moment of quiet reflection, or an intimate encounter while your entire extended family, a few farm animals, and a couple of itinerant poets are all in the same room. Welcome to the Viking Longhouse, the architectural embodiment of a society with absolutely no concept of personal privacy. The Longhouse was the center of Viking life, a long, narrow, single-room dwelling that housed not just a nuclear family, but an entire clan. These structures, often built of timber with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof, could be enormous, some stretching over 200 feet long. Inside, a central fire pit ran down the middle of the earthen floor, providing light, warmth, and a constant choking cloud of smoke that supposedly helped preserve the wooden beams. There were no internal walls, no separate bedrooms, no private studies. Life was lived communally, out in the open. Down each side of the longhouse were raised wooden platforms that served as all-purpose furniture. By day, they were benches for sitting, working, and eating. By night, they were beds. Families would sleep together on these platforms, huddled under furs and wool blankets for warmth. The head of the household and his wife would typically have the prime spot near the center, but they were still just a few feet away from their children, their in-laws, their cousins, and their slaves. There were no doors to close, no curtains to draw. Every sound carried. Every argument was public. Every secret was a whisper away from being overheard. This lack of privacy profoundly shaped Viking social dynamics. It fostered a strong sense of community and interdependence, but it also meant that every individual was under constant scrutiny. Your actions were not your own. They belonged to the group. If you were lazy, quarrelsome, or violated a social norm, everyone knew it instantly. There was no hiding. This environment also dictated how intimacy was handled. As discussed, sexual encounters were likely quick, quiet affairs under the cover of darkness. The idea of a romantic private space was a physical impossibility. Children were born, people fell ill, and the elderly died, all within the same shared space. The most profound and personal moments of human existence, birth, death, love, sickness, were community events. Even personal hygiene was public. While Vikings were cleaner than their stereotypes suggest, bathing often happened in a nearby river or in a communal sauna-like structure, not in a private bathroom. The longhouse was more than a home. It was a microcosm of Viking society. It was loud, smoky, crowded, and stripped of all pretense. It was a place where the individual was subsumed by the collective, where survival depended on cooperation, and where the concept of alone time would have been as foreign and bizarre as a phone or a toothbrush. Your life was an open book, and everyone in the longhouse had a front row seat to read it. In the Viking world, the gods were not distant, ethereal beings sitting on cloudy thrones. They were flawed, passionate, and deeply involved in the messy business of life, love, and sex. The Norse pantheon, with its tales of divine affairs, cosmic betrayals, and godly desires, provided a mythological blueprint that both reflected and justified the complex social and sexual norms of the Vikings themselves. At the forefront of love and desire was Freya, one of the most powerful and multifaceted goddesses. She was not a gentle, cherubic deity of romance. Freya was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, sex, but also of war, wealth, and a form of magic called Cedra. She was a figure of immense power and unapologetic sexuality. She was said to have had many lovers, both gods and mortals, and she wore Brisingamen, a magnificent necklace she acquired by sleeping with 4 dwarves. This wasn't seen as shameful. It was a demonstration of her power and her command over her own desirability. She was the divine embodiment of female agency, both creative and destructive. Then there was Odin, the All-Father, a god of wisdom, war, and poetry, but also a notorious wanderer with a complicated love life. He was married to the goddess Frigg, the protector of marriage and households, yet he frequently pursued other goddesses and mortal women. His affairs often had world-altering consequences, producing heroic offspring and divine drama. This divine hypocrisy mirrored the double standards seen in Viking society, where a man's extramarital affairs were often tolerated, while a wife's were not. Thor, the mighty god of thunder, was the ideal of masculine strength and protection. His marriage to the golden-haired goddess Sif represented the ideal partnership. The strong, protective husband and the beautiful, respectable wife. Yet even their relationship was fraught with drama, most famously when the trickster god Loki cut off all of Sif's hair as a prank, an act that deeply shamed Thor and led to a violent quest for retribution. Loki himself was the ultimate agent of chaos, a shapeshifter who defied all norms of gender and sexuality. He gave birth to monstrous children, including the wolf Fenrir and the world serpent Jörmungandr, and in one famous story, transformed into a mare to lure away a giant stallion, subsequently giving birth to Odin's 8-legged steed, Sleipnir. Loki's character represents the fluid, dangerous, and unpredictable nature of desire when it breaks free from social constraints. The stories of the gods were not children's fables. They were a reflection of the Viking worldview. They showed that love was powerful, sex was a tool for creation and conflict, and that even the gods were subject to the chaotic forces of jealousy, lust, and betrayal. These myths didn't provide a simple moral code. They presented a complex, messy, and very human vision of the universe, where the sacred and the profane were always intertwined. For centuries, the pagan traditions of the Norse people guided their understanding of life, death, and relationships. Their world was one of contracts, honor, and a pragmatic acceptance of human nature. But starting in the 10th century, a new force began to sweep across Scandinavia, bringing with it a radically different worldview: Christianity. The conversion of the Viking world was not a sudden event, but a slow, often violent, and transformative process that would fundamentally reshape their society. And nowhere was this change more profound than in the realm of sex and marriage. Christianity introduced concepts that were utterly foreign to the old Norse way of life. The Church taught that marriage was not a dissolvable social contract, but a holy sacrament, a lifelong bond ordained by God. Divorce, once a straightforward public declaration, became nearly impossible. This stripped away one of the most significant legal protections that Viking women had possessed. A woman trapped in an abusive or neglectful marriage no longer had an easy exit strategy. The new religion also brought with it the concept of sin, particularly sexual sin. Sex was no longer viewed as a natural, if complicated, part of life. It was now framed by the doctrines of chastity, monogamy, and procreation. Sex outside of marriage was condemned as fornication. The accepted practice of a man having concubines, frilla, was outlawed. A man was now expected to be faithful to one wife, a radical shift from the old patriarchal system. This change, while seemingly promoting equality, was part of a broader shift that often diminished a woman's status. While the Church condemned a man's extramarital affairs, it also reinforced the idea of the husband as the undisputed head of the household, with his wife expected to be pious, submissive, and obedient. The powerful, quasi-independent role of the husfreyja began to erode, replaced by the more constrained ideal of the Christian wife. The Church's influence also extended to the legal system. Secular law codes were gradually replaced or amended with ecclesiastical law. Inheritance rules changed, often favouring the Church and legitimate children over all others. The old pagan rituals surrounding weddings, the exchange of swords, the public oaths, were replaced by Christian ceremonies officiated by priests. The very language of love and relationships began to change. The old emphasis on honour, kinship, and contract was slowly supplanted by the Christian virtues of faith, fidelity, and forgiveness. This was not a smooth transition. For generations, the old ways and the new faith coexisted in a tense and often contradictory balance. People might be baptized as Christians but still hold on to old superstitions and traditions. But over time, the new religion took root, and the Viking Age, with its unique social and sexual landscape, faded into history. The world of easy divorce, powerful housewives, and accepted concubinage was gone, replaced by a new moral order that would dominate Europe for the next 1,000 years. No image is more synonymous with the fierce women of the Viking Age than the shield maiden, a female warrior, clad in armour, fighting shoulder to shoulder with men. She is a powerful, romantic, and enduring archetype. But was she a historical reality? The answer, like most things in the Viking world, is complicated. A blend of myth, literary embellishment, and a kernel of tantalizing truth. The primary evidence for shield maidens comes from a few key literary sources, most notably the 13th century Danish history, Gesta Danorum, by Saxo Grammaticus. He describes women who put military zeal before the blandishments of the family and fought in battle to avoid the weakness of a domestic life. The sagas also feature warrior women, like Hervor in Hervarar saga, who takes up her father's cursed sword and leads a band of Vikings. These stories are compelling, but they were written down centuries after the Viking Age, often by Christian authors who may have been romanticizing a pagan past or using the figure of the female warrior as a literary device to represent the otherness of the old ways. These were stories, not historical records. However, the myth isn't purely literary. There are scattered historical accounts from other cultures that mention encountering what appeared to be female warriors among the Norse. The Byzantine historian John Skylitzes described women fighting among the Varangian Guard during a battle in the 11th century. These accounts are brief and often filtered through the lens of a foreign observer, but they suggest that the idea wasn't entirely fantastical. The most compelling evidence has come from archaeology. For a long time, the existence of female warriors was dismissed by many historians, but recent discoveries have forced a re-evaluation. The most famous case is the Birka warrior, a 10th century grave in Sweden that was long assumed to be the burial of a high-status male warrior. The grave was filled with a full set of weapons: a sword, an axe, spears, arrows, and the remains of 2 horses. It was the quintessential Viking warrior burial. However, a 2017 DNA analysis of the bones revealed that the skeleton was, in fact, female. This discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community. Could this be a real-life shield maiden, a woman who held a high military command? The debate still rages. Some scholars argue that the presence of weapons in a grave doesn't definitively prove the person was a warrior. They could have been symbolic. Others maintain that this is the strongest physical evidence yet that women could and did take on warrior roles in Viking society. So, what's the verdict? It's likely that the shield maiden as a common widespread phenomenon is a myth. The average Viking woman was not a frontline warrior. Her power was in the household, as the husfreyja. However, it is entirely possible, and increasingly supported by evidence, that some exceptional women did break the mold. In a society where survival was paramount, it's conceivable that women would have been trained to defend the farmstead when the men were away. And some may have chosen the path of the warrior, earning their place through skill and ferocity. The shield maiden may not have been the norm, but she wasn't impossible. She exists in that fascinating grey area where myth and history meet. If you were a young Viking dreaming of marriage, you wouldn't be planning a romantic proposal or a series of charming dates. You'd be preparing for a formal, high-stakes negotiation process that felt more like a corporate merger than the beginning of a love story. Courtship in the Viking Age was not a private affair between 2 individuals. It was a public transaction between 2 families, and every step was governed by tradition and law. The process began with the bonord, the formal proposal. This was not done by the prospective groom himself. That would be seen as arrogant and improper. Instead, the proposal was made by a delegation, usually led by the groom's father or another respected male relative, accompanied by a group of influential friends. This group would travel to the home of the prospective bride's father to formally ask for her hand. This wasn't a casual chat over mead. It was a serious legal and economic discussion. The groom's delegation would have to present his qualifications, his family's wealth, his land holdings, his reputation, and his prospects. They were essentially making a sales pitch. In return, the bride's father would state the terms of the marriage, most importantly, the size of the hymenfylgja, or dowry, that she would bring to the union. The dowry was a crucial part of the negotiation. It was property, land, livestock, silver, or valuable goods that the bride brought into the marriage. Legally, it remained her property. If the marriage ended in divorce, she took it with her. This gave her a significant degree of economic security and power within the relationship. There would be haggling, of course. Gifts would be exchanged as a sign of goodwill and to smooth over any disagreements. The entire process could take a significant amount of time, as messengers might travel back and forth between the two families. The bride's opinion was rarely, if ever, solicited. Her consent was assumed to be given by her father or guardian. She was the subject of the negotiation, not a participant in it. Once both families agreed on the terms, the betrothal, or festa, was made official. This was a legally binding contract, sealed with oaths and handshakes in front of witnesses. The groom's family would pay a munda, or bride price, to the bride's father. This wasn't buying the bride. It was more of a compensation to her family for the loss of her labour and for transferring her into a new kin group. It was a seal on the deal. From this point on, the couple was legally engaged. Breaking the betrothal would be a serious breach of contract, resulting in fines and a loss of honour. The path to marriage was not paved with romance, but with cold, hard, practical considerations. It was a system designed to create stable households, strong alliances, and a clear line of inheritance. It wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was about finding the right partner for a lifelong business venture. In a society built on the fragile and explosive concept of honour, emotions like jealousy were not just personal feelings. They were social and political forces that could ignite devastating blood feuds. The sagas are a testament to this, filled with dark and tragic tales of how romantic rivalry and wounded pride could unravel families and consume generations. Jealousy in the Viking Age was a powerful and deadly motivator, and it was almost always tied to a perceived slight against a man's honour. The most common trigger was, unsurprisingly, adultery or the suspicion of it. A man's wife was a reflection of his status, and any threat to her fidelity was a direct threat to his reputation. The sagas show us that the mere rumour of an affair could be enough to spark violence. In the Njáls saga, one of the most famous Icelandic epics, the relationship between the two heroes, Gunnar and Njál, is ultimately destroyed by the scheming and jealousy of their wives, Hallgerda and Bergþóra. Their petty insults and rivalries escalate into a series of killings that neither man can stop, pulling both families into a spiral of vengeance from which there is no escape. Love triangles were another common literary and likely real-life catalyst for tragedy. When two men desired the same woman, the competition was rarely settled peacefully. It was a contest of honour, and the outcome was often determined by who was the better poet, the better warrior, or simply the more ruthless. In the Cormac saga, the poet Cormaca loves a woman named Steingrdr, but due to a curse, he fails to show up for their wedding. She marries another man, and Cormaca spends the rest of his life composing beautiful, tormented poems about her, while challenging her husband to duels. His jealousy consumes him, turning his love into a source of endless conflict. But jealousy wasn't limited to romantic rivals. It could also be professional. A man could become jealous of another's wealth, his skill as a warrior, or the favour he received from a king. This envy could fester, leading to slander, sabotage, and eventually, open conflict. Revenge was not just an option, it was a social obligation. If your honor or your family's honor was slighted, you were expected to respond. Failure to do so would brand you a coward. This is why jealousy was so dangerous. It didn't just cause personal pain, it triggered a formal, often legal, requirement for retaliation. A whispered rumor in a longhouse could, over the course of a few years, lead to a dozen deaths, burned farms, and exiled families. The sagas show us a world where emotions were not meant to be processed, but to be acted upon. Jealousy was not something to be overcome with therapy. It was something to be settled with an axe. It was a fire that, once lit, was almost impossible to extinguish, and it left a trail of ashes and sorrow across the landscape of the Viking Age. To understand how Viking society functioned, you have to understand the concept of frith. This Old Norse term is often translated as peace, but its meaning is much deeper and more complex. Frith was the invisible social glue that held their world together. It was a powerful web of kinship, loyalty, friendship, and mutual obligation that bound individuals, families, and entire communities. Without frith, there was only chaos and feud. At its core, frith was about belonging. You were born into a network of frith with your kin group. Your family was your primary source of identity, protection, and support. An injury to one member was an injury to all, and the entire kin was obligated to seek justice or revenge. This is why feuds could become so devastating. They were a breakdown of frith between two families, but frith could also be created and extended. This is where marriage played a crucial role. A marriage was not just a union of two people. It was a deliberate act of peace weaving. When two families were joined by marriage, they entered into a state of frith with each other. They became allies, obligated to support and defend one another. The exchange of gifts, the public oaths, the shared feast, all of these wedding rituals were designed to forge this sacred bond. The woman, as the bride, was often the frith weaver herself, the living link between the two clans. A successful marriage strengthened the frith of the entire community. A failed marriage could shatter it, leading to disputes over dowries, insults to honour, and the potential for a new feud. Frith also extended to one's relationship with a chieftain or king. By swearing allegiance to a leader, you entered into his frith. He was obligated to protect you, provide for you, and reward you for your loyalty. In return, you were obligated to fight for him and uphold his honour. This network of loyalty was the foundation of Viking Age political power. Breaking this bond was an act of treason. The concept even had a physical dimension. Your home, your farmstead, was your frith yard, a sanctuary of peace and safety. Within its boundaries, you and your guests were protected by the laws of hospitality. To harm a guest in your home was one of the most dishonourable acts a person could commit, a grave violation of frith. Frith was a fragile thing, constantly in need of maintenance through gift-giving, honouring oaths, and showing respect. It was a social contract that demanded active participation. In a world without a strong central government or a formal police force, frith was the system that kept society from descending into a perpetual state of war. It was the collective agreement to choose order over anarchy, loyalty over self-interest, and peace, however temporary, over endless bloodshed. At the very bottom of the Viking social ladder, far below the free farmers and even the landless poor, were the thralls. These were the enslaved people of the Viking world, and their lives were defined by a complete lack of rights, protection, and humanity. When we talk about relationships in the Viking Age, it is crucial to remember this population, whose experiences were shaped by brutal exploitation. Thralls were considered property, no different from cattle or a piece of land. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or killed with little to no legal consequence. The majority of thralls were foreigners captured during raids, Slavs, Celts, Anglo-Saxons. But some were Norse people who'd been born into slavery or had fallen into it through debt or punishment. For these enslaved individuals, the concept of a legally recognized relationship did not exist. They had no right to marry. Any partnership they formed was informal and entirely at the mercy of their owner. An owner could separate a thrall couple at any time, selling one of them off to another farmstead without a second thought. Their children were also the property of the owner, born into the same state of bondage as their parents. The most horrifying aspect of a thrall's existence was the constant threat of sexual exploitation, particularly for women. As we've discussed, a male owner had the unrestricted right to have sex with his female thralls. This was not a secret or a scandal. It was an accepted part of the system. The children born from these forced unions were slaves, belonging to their father owner. This created a complex and tragic dynamic within the longhouse, where the legal wife, the husfreyja, would have to live alongside her husband's enslaved mistresses and their children. The sagas are filled with matter-of-fact references to this reality. A chieftain's power was often measured by the size of his household, including the number of thralls he owned. These enslaved people performed the most grueling labour, tilling the fields, tending the livestock, building the longhouses, and serving the free members of the family. They ate the worst food, wore the roughest clothes, and slept in the least desirable parts of the longhouse, often near the animals. There was a path to freedom, or leisingi. An owner could choose to free a thrall, either as a reward for loyal service or upon the owner's death. A thrall could also theoretically buy their own freedom if they managed to accumulate wealth, though this was incredibly rare. But even a freed slave was not truly free. They remained in a state of dependency on their former owner, owing them loyalty and service, and they never achieved the full status of a free-born person. The lives of thralls were a stark reminder of the brutal hierarchy of the Viking Age. Their lack of personal and relational rights highlights the fact that the honor, laws, and protections that define Norse society were privileges reserved for the free. For the enslaved, there was no frith, no honor, and no justice, only survival. Let's try to summarize the romantic journey of a typical free Viking. Your life begins, and if you survive the perilous gauntlet of infancy, your destiny is already being mapped out, not by the stars, but by your family's assets and ambitions. As a young man or woman, you are a pawn in a much larger game of alliances and economics. There is no concept of dating, no period of getting to know someone. Your future spouse is chosen for you based on a cold calculation of their family's wealth, status, and the potential for a beneficial alliance. The proposal is a formal negotiation between patriarchs, a business meeting where your future is the primary agenda item. Once the dowry and bride price are settled, you are legally betrothed. The wedding is a public spectacle, a multi-day feast designed to broadcast the new alliance to the entire community. Oaths are sworn, swords are exchanged, and you are ceremoniously put to bed with a near stranger to consummate the deal. Now, you are married. If you are the husband, your life is one of relentless pressure. You must provide, protect, and defend your family's honor. You are the public face of the household, but your authority is not absolute. Your wife, the husfreyja, is your partner, the powerful manager of the domestic realm. She holds the keys, controls the resources, and has the legal right to divorce you if you fail in your duties as a provider or protector. Your sexual life is a study in double standards. You are expected to beget heirs with your wife, but you are free to take concubines, often enslaved women, to satisfy your desires and display your status. However, if you dare to touch another man's wife, you are likely to end up dead. If you are the wife, your world is the longhouse. You are a commander of the domestic sphere, wielding considerable power over the household's economy and daily life. Your fidelity, however, must be absolute. An affair would bring ruin not just upon you, but upon your entire family. Yet, you hold a revolutionary power, the right to divorce. If your husband is abusive, incompetent, or shames you, you can publicly declare the marriage over and walk away with your dowry. Love, in this pragmatic world, is an afterthought. It may grow from the soil of mutual respect and shared struggle, but it is not the seed. Your primary bond is one of partnership and duty. Your life is lived communally, in a smoky longhouse where privacy is an unknown luxury. Your relationships are governed by a complex code of honor, where a poorly chosen word can be as fatal as a well-aimed axe. This is the reality of your love life in the Viking Age, a blend of stark pragmatism, brutal inequality, and surprising moments of legal empowerment. It is not romantic, but it is resilient, a system built to endure in a harsh and unforgiving world. The echoes of the Viking Age and its unique approach to relationships and social structure did not simply vanish with the arrival of Christianity and the end of the Longship era. Many of the core tenets of Norse culture, its pragmatism, its emphasis on law, and its complex gender dynamics, left a lasting imprint on the development of Scandinavian society for centuries to come. One of the most significant legacies is the surprisingly strong legal standing of women. While the Christianization of Scandinavia gradually eroded many of the old pagan rights, such as easy divorce and female property ownership, the cultural memory of the powerful husfreyja lingered. Compared to many other parts of medieval Europe, women in Scandinavia often retained a higher degree of social and economic influence. The idea of a woman as a capable and respected partner in the running of a household or farm was deeply ingrained and did not disappear overnight. This tradition can be seen as a distant ancestor of the more egalitarian gender roles for which modern Scandinavia is known today. The Viking emphasis on law and public assembly also had a profound influence. The tradition of the Thing, the local assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and witness contracts, laid the groundwork for a strong tradition of local governance and legal process. The idea that justice should be a public and transparent affair, even if it was often brutal, helped to shape a legal culture that valued order and agreement. The sagas themselves, written down in the Christian period, but chronicling the pagan past, became a cornerstone of Scandinavian, and particularly Icelandic, cultural identity. They preserved not just the stories of heroes and feuds, but also the intricate details of the old social structure, the legal codes, and the complex web of honor and obligation. These texts kept the memory of the Viking worldview alive, providing a link to a pre-Christian identity that was fierce, independent, and uniquely northern. However, the darker aspects also cast a long shadow. The legacy of raiding and the US versus them mentality, which justified the brutalization of outsiders, is a reminder of the violent foundations upon which the Viking Age was built. The ingrained double standards in sexual morality, while challenged by the Church, did not disappear entirely, and the tension between male and female roles continued to evolve over centuries. In essence, the Viking approach to relationships was a high-stakes balancing act between individual honor and collective survival, between brutal pragmatism and deep-seated traditions of law and order. This complex legacy, a blend of progressive female rights and stark patriarchal control, of legal sophistication and violent retribution, did not die with the last Viking. It was absorbed, transformed, and woven into the very fabric of the nations that rose from the ashes of the Longhouse fires, leaving a faint but indelible pattern that can still be traced today. So, after our journey through the smoky longhouses, the fraught marriage negotiations, and the brutal legal codes of the Viking Age, let's return to the question we started with. Forget the horned helmets, the epic romances, and the cinematic heroes. If you, a modern human armed with modern sensibilities, were dropped into this world, how would your love life fare? Let's be brutally honest. You wouldn't survive the first negotiation. You, who believe in love, compatibility, and mutual consent, would be utterly bewildered by a system where your entire romantic future is a business transaction negotiated by your father. The idea of marrying a stranger to secure a piece of land or a favorable trade route would seem not just unromantic, but insane. You would expect privacy, a concept as foreign to the Vikings as Wi-Fi. The reality of sharing a single smoky room with your entire extended family and having your sex life be an open secret would likely send you running for the nearest fjord. You would chafe under the rigid gender roles. If you're a man, the constant pressure to be a stoic warrior provider, where one perceived slight to your honor could lead to a bloody duel, would be exhausting. If you're a woman, the lack of a public voice and the absolute requirement of fidelity, all while managing a household with the logistical precision of a quartermaster, would feel suffocating despite the surprising legal right to divorce. The double standards would drive you mad. The accepted practice of concubinage and sexual slavery would be morally repugnant, and you'd find it impossible to reconcile the culture's deep respect for a free woman's honor with its complete disregard for an enslaved woman's humanity. And yet, to dismiss the Vikings as simple, unfeeling barbarians would be a profound mistake. Theirs was a society of incredible complexity. They created a system that, for all its flaws, was remarkably resilient. They crafted laws that gave women more power than almost any other contemporary culture. They produced poetry of heartbreaking beauty and sagas of epic psychological depth. They were not romantics, but they understood loyalty. They were not sentimental, but they were capable of deep and fierce devotion. They built their world not on the flimsy foundation of fleeting emotion, but on the bedrock of contract, honor, and a pragmatic understanding of what it took to survive in a cold and dangerous land. You wouldn't last because your world and theirs are built on fundamentally different principles. You search for a soulmate. They searched for a steadfast partner in the brutal business of living. And while we may look back in horror at their violence and inequality, we must also look back in awe at their strength, their artistry, and the strange, stark beauty of the world they built together.